Hello, everybody. My name is Gilda Ross. I'm the Glenbard Student and Community Projects Coordinator. This is a conversation between two very important authors, and I am so eager to begin. I thank you for the gift of your time and your trust. This hour will be well worth your time, and I might suggest making a call or texting someone. I think you will find them grateful for the fact that you reached out. This is critically important to our community. So thank you again. And thank you to the sponsors who make this possible, like the DuPage County Health Department, an important partner in this important presentation that will happen today at noon and at 7 p.m. Central Time again. I'd like to quickly tell you about upcoming programs before we begin. Next week, tomorrow actually, to kick off Black History Month, we are inviting Dr. Tyrone Howard. He is the chairman of the School of Education at UCLA. We'll be talking about his important book, All Students Must Thrive, Nurturing Connection and Belonging, an enlightening conversation. Next week, we're going to be talking about what parents need to know about the future of careers and college. Mark Perna will be with us on the 6th, Tuesday at noon and at 7 p.m. And then as we begin Live Life Well Week, we're going to be talking with Sonia this one I struggle with, Lombersky. She will be talking about her really groundbreaking research on happiness. And she'll be talking about her book, The How of Happiness in All Areas of Life, Enhancing Your Potential for Joy, on the 15th, noon at 7 p.m. Then we're going into Live Life Well Week on the 22nd. The keynote for the students will be with us. Eric Jackson will also have a health resource fair on the 22nd at Glenbard West in person. Also hybrid at 6:30 to 7 p.m. We close out the month with Dr. Lori DeSalutis. The eyes are never quiet, listening behind the behavior of kids. So a very, very busy month. You want to go to the website, find the links, and take a look at all the programming that GPS has scheduled. And so without further ado, Mila Sagalis is the Director of Community Initiatives for the DuPage County Health Department. My colleague, I'm honored to have her do the introductions. Mila, take it away.
Thank you, Gilda. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers this afternoon. We are joined today by David Sheff, who is the author of A Beautiful Boy, A Father's Journey Through His Son's Addiction, a #1 New York Times bestseller. The award-winning book was published in 12 languages, and The Beautiful Boy was later adapted as a film, starring Steve Carell and Timothée Chalamet. David followed Beautiful Boy with Clean, Overcoming Addiction and Ending America's Greatest Tragedy. This was also a New York Times bestseller. Clean was a result of the years Sheff spent investigating the disease of addiction and America's drug problem, which he sees as the greatest public health challenge of our time. And I'll just add here that as the health department, we fully agree with that and see those issues in our communities too. He is also the author of Hi, Everything You Want to Know About Drugs for Young Adults, written with Nick Sheff. The Partnership for Drug-Free Kids honored him with a special tribute award in recognition of his voice and leadership for families who are struggling with addiction. Today, David will be joined by Jessica Lahey, the author of New York Times bestselling book, The Gift of Failure, How the Best Parents Learn to Let Go of Their Children So They Can Succeed, and The Addiction Inoculation, Raising Healthy Kids in a Culture of Dependence. Jessica was awarded the Research Society on Alcohol Media Award for outstanding journalistic efforts of writers who cover research on alcohol for her book, The Addiction Inoculation, and also her advocacy for the recovery community. I'm going to turn this over to Jessica to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. Welcome to my hotel room out on the road. I have to point out, first and foremost, it's hard to see because I've blurred here, but this is my copy of Clean. It's got tape holding the spine together. It's got all the little tabs in it. And I brought it along with me just to show how important I think this book is and how important I think the book Hi is. I get asked over and over and over again if there are resources out there for teenagers. And we're going to be talking a lot about, Beautiful Boy and what David has learned and what he's doing these days. But Hi, I think, is one of the most important resources out there for adolescents younger people and adolescents around substance use. But I am so excited to be here today because I have been a fan of David's for ages, since the first article in the New York Times that led to the book Beautiful Boy. And so it's one of those wonderful full circle moments for me, especially since at the time I was struggling with my own substance use disorder. So for me to be here in this place talking now 10 years into recovery, talking about someone who has really gone through this fire, I'm just so excited to speak with you today, David.
Well, thank you, Jessica. I'm so excited to be speaking with you. And thank you also to Mila and to Gilda. This parent series is pretty extraordinary. I followed for years. I visited in the past. And I just think what you do is wonderful.
Inevitably we have to go through, for those of people in the audience who may not know much about your story, I would love to go quickly sort of through your story with Nick, your son, and this trial by fire. As I mentioned, some of us end up experts on things that we never ever thought we would have to become experts on, and both of us, I think, are in that same boat. And then I'd love to talk about a lot of the questions that I get from parents specifically as it relates to the work that you do. So could you tell us a little bit about your experience and how you ended up in this place?
Yeah, well, trial by fire, you've got it. It's exactly right. I had no interest, no thoughts about addiction. I mean, I had an image of what a drug addict, in quotes, looked like. And boy, it sure didn't look like my son. And what I learned over time is that, no one is immune, no family is immune, and this could happen to anybody, any of our children. And that happened because my son, who was growing up, I warned him about drugs. I talked to him about drugs. I thought I was being a responsible parent. But when he was very, very young, only 11, 12 years old, I found out that he was smoking marijuana, or at least he'd tried it. And at the time, I went to his teacher and his counselor at his school and was worried. And they told me exactly the wrong things. They said, Nick is this great kid. He's going to be fine. Kids experiment. It's a rite of passage. There's a peer pressure, and Nick turned out not to be fine. What they should have told me is that we know from research that the younger a child is who starts to use any form of drug, the more likely they will have problems in their lives, including potentially addiction. But Nick's drug use just escalated from there to the point that basically he used every drug you can think about. It was a nightmare. We lived it for 10 years. Nick almost died several times. I got calls from emergency room doctors twice. One time they were going to potentially have to amputate his arm because it had been infected because of IV drug use. Another time they just said they didn't know he was going to make it. Eventually Nick got clean and stayed sober for a while. It wasn't the last time that he relapsed. But when he did, that's when I went forward and I wrote the article in the New York Times that you mentioned. And that that changed my life. It changed my world, because I realized when that article came out for the first time how many families were affected and how parents were devastated like I was. And it became a mission of mine to try to understand what happened to Nick, what's happening to so many of our other children, what's happening to our communities. When I went from that New York Times article to the book Beautiful Boy, and Beautiful Boy became a movie, it just expanded that. It just brought in more and more people to enter a conversation that people don't have, because so often when we talk about other problems, this one's different. And it's different because of what you know well, and it's different because of the stigma, because of the shame that's involved in this. And so people keep quiet, people hide when they're going through something like this. And it's only when we have conversations like the one we're having today that we're going to be able to make an impact and help our kids grow up healthily.
Thank you for mentioning that, because I definitely want, one of the things I do when I'm talking about risk factors and how we can more, if we can be as objective as possible about risk factors, then hopefully we can be as specific as possible with our prevention. But that really requires us we have to let go of the shame and the guilt, because, for example, there are, lots of risk factors like divorce and separation are incredibly common. And so the minute I say that according to the CDC, divorce and separation is is an adverse childhood experience that is a risk factor for substance use disorder, there are lots of ears that close down because you just don't want to think about the risk that you may have inadvertently, heaped on your kids. So it's really important that we got to let go of the shame and guilt. In fact, my kid, every once in a while, my two kids, they're like, do you have to tell everyone that you're in recovery or that you're an alcoholic? And I'm like, well, sometimes, yeah, I do. Because every single time I do, I get, as you do, I know lots and lots of emails and letters from people saying, you're the first person I've heard that say that out loud, or I just really need to talk to someone who also has that going on. And then there's this added layer of, as a parent, it's not just that you love your kid deeply and you want to protect them, but it also looks a little bit like some sort of failure on our part as parents. And so I would love, before we get into sort of the real meat of the conversation around, risk and prevention and what we should be looking for, how do you reconcile for yourself constantly talking about this thing and being able to understand that at a certain level, there's not much you can do differently? There's some things you can do, and yet there's other things that you just have to be able to let go of, like divorce, for example, which I know you went through as well.
Yeah, I went through a divorce. I did a lot of other things that I look back horrified about, because I do know, as you say, we do know that all the various kinds of stress that we put on our kids as they're growing up increase the likelihood. It makes sense. When Nick describes getting high for the first time, he describes it in a way that is really important for me anyway to understand, which is that he doesn't talk about it in terms of, the great feeling of elation and being high and partying and all that kind of stuff. He talks about the absence of anxiety that he had felt and he'd held inside himself for all of that time. And so when I realized that, I realized, oh God, I wish I could have protected him more. The problem with that is that we just can only do the best we can do. And every kid whose parents get divorced does not end up having drug problems. But some of them do. And it is because obviously that does increase the trauma, the stress, the experience that they have had growing up. But there are many other things. And as you sort of allude to, the good thing about having these conversations and to acknowledge the fact that these risk factors exist is that there also are protective factors, including something is maybe obvious, but maybe not obvious, that if a parent is going through a divorce and we know that it's going to be stressful for our kids, what can we do to mitigate some of that stress for our children? And there is a lot that we can do. We can help them in conversations in our own families. We can reassure them about their position in the family. We can we can rely on professionals, psychologists, to go into family therapy or child therapy. I mean, there's a lot we can do, but none of it will happen if we don't have the conversations. What happened when my book came out, and I'm sure you've had the same experience, is that I've heard from so many people who say, your family story is my family story, but I don't talk about it because of the shame, because of the stigma. It's sort of like we have this idea, this image that everybody else is sailing through. I love what Annie Lamott says when she says, we increase our pain and our suffering by comparing our insides with other people's outsides. We think that we're suffering and everybody else is just sailing through, but nobody is sailing through. And when we open up, we can have conversations like this. We can get support, and we can also get help. We can get very concrete help about what we can do to help our children.
So since I know that this is the number one question I get from parents, I want to get straight into an answer to this question, because you have to be comfortable with a little bit of gray area when we're talking about substance use and substance use disorder, because there's still a lot we don't know, but there is a lot we do know. And a lot of it relies on like your individual child and you as an individual parent and all that sort of stuff. But the biggest question I get, number one question I get, is how do I know when my kid's in trouble? How do I know when maybe I've found paraphernalia, or I know they're using, or their moods are changing, or their sleep is changing? How do we know where that line is? And you talk so eloquently about wishing you jumped in earlier. So where exactly is that point at which your parental alarm bells should go off and we should know that it's time to act?
Well, I think that we are, as parents, we're sort of programmed to be in denial because we don't want to see the truth. If our kids are in trouble, it's really scary. And then we also have to ask the second question, the one you're raising now, is what do we do about it? I think that we also have to learn to trust our instincts more, which is to suggest that if we think there's a problem, there very well could be a problem, and maybe there probably is a problem, but we are just parents. We don't know. What's the difference between a child who is sad, because all kids get sad sometimes, and people have to be allowed to experience those different kinds of emotions, the negative emotions as well as the positive ones. But what's the difference between that and a child who is suffering from some sort of psychological problem, anxiety, depression? Only years later was Nick finally diagnosed with having bipolar disorder and depression. And if we had known those things when he was very young and gotten some interventions, perhaps things would not have gone. I mean, Nick feels, and I feel, that it would not have gone, things that would not have spiraled in the ways that they spiraled. So how do we know? The answer is that I feel like we can't know. And that's why we have to rely on our professionals in our community. If a child is experiencing some of the things that you mentioned, seeming isolated, seeming down consistently, seeming depressed, seeming stressed, seeming anxious, super worried about peer stuff, could they be being bullied? Could they be, is there cyberbullying? I mean, there's so many different factors that can be troubling for our kids. That's the time to go have a conversation with a teacher, potentially a counselor, a school counselor. And if we're concerned that maybe things are worse than we know, it's potentially time to go consult with a child psychologist or a family psychologist. And we may find out, we may be reassured at that point to say that everything's okay, but we want to err on the side of caution. That's where I come down.
There's one other thing that I think people forget is that change in any direction is something we should be paying attention to. If you have a kid who's been really, really down and suddenly they have a lot of energy and they're really up, I, as a parent, would be like, oh, thank goodness. And I wouldn't want to look that gift horse in the mouth. But that is a signal of change as well. And whether that's because, suddenly they have a new group of friends that they're excited about, that's a conversation I would like to have. It's a great doorway to all of these important conversations. And then one other thing is, everyone tends to go straight to psychologists and psychiatrists, which is fantastic. I'd love to point out for those in the audience about some other allies that are out there. Most primary care practitioners are skilled in sort of a risk screening of some sort of or another. So when your kid is going to their annual checkup, make sure you give them room to do those little sort of iPad surveys before their appointment, because some of the questions on there are things like, have you ever gotten into a car with a drunk driver? And that's really important information for the primary care physician to have. They can be a real ally. And school nurses, school counselors. School counselors are not the school counselors that we grew up with, the people who sort of keep an eye over detention. They're people with master's degrees. And so there are lots of allies that we may not think of right away. And I just want to make sure they get a shout out because they're really, really important.
Yeah, and I'd add the one other thing, of course, is we can't know everything, but there are ways that we can create a very safe environment in our homes to have conversations with our children where we are not judging them, we are not threatening them with some sort of punishment, but making them feel safe so that we can talk to them about what stresses might be happening during the day at school. If we recognize that and if they can talk to us about it, that is obviously the most important first step, because we want to nurture those relationships and that kind of conversation. And we are not given manuals when our kids are born. And sometimes we have to learn the skills of having those kinds of open conversations. And there are a lot of resources about how to do that. You've worked in this field. You offer some of those resources.
Yeah, there's as the person who wrote the book, The Gift of Failure, about giving your kids more autonomy, staying out of their business a little bit, giving them more freedom. And then as the person who wrote a book about protecting your kids from substance use, when we look at statistics like, you know, for example, one of the times that kids might initiate substance use is over summers when they're alone with their friends. But the answer to protecting them from that is not never letting them leave the house and be alone with their friends. My husband, who's a physician, always says, you know, we'd have a lot less skin cancer if people never left the house. But that's not an answer to this problem either. So there's this very fine line to walk between being a caring and conscientious parent, and especially with some of the tools that we have now that we can use to sort of keep an eye on them all the time, and going completely overboard, especially since there is research also that shows that kids who are more controlled by their parents and surveilled by their parents tend to lie to their parents more. And I think this comes back to what you're talking about, is coming from a place not of judgment, but of love and support, so that you can keep that communication open. Were you and Nick continuing to talk as much as he was capable of having these conversations while he was in the middle of his substance use? Because, you know, it can be really difficult to try to reason with someone who is not in the right frame of mind to be reasoning.
Yeah, as Nick, initially we did, and in fact, that's partly why I was so shocked when Nick's drug use began, and then it escalated, because I had this idea that we were different than my family. You know, we had these very open heart-to-heart conversations. I knew what was going on with him, and therefore I would know what was going on with him. What I realized is that he had his own life independent of me, as is appropriate, as you described. And then it got trickier, because once substance use kicked in, he was not forthcoming at all. And he was very defensive. And he was always, you know, if I was on his case about something, I became the enemy. I was trying to control him. And in truth, I was. And I didn't have the skills to have the kinds of conversations that can we know be helpful, be extraordinarily helpful, which is, you know, may have been to talk about something. Nick didn't know, he was a child, so he didn't know he had depression or bipolar disorder. But if I had had a different kind of open relationship with him, I may have had more of a sense of how much he was struggling. And therefore, perhaps I would have done something differently. And you know, again, on one hand, I say we can only do the best we can do. We're parents, we're not trained to do this. On the other hand, you know, we do have we are the most important force in our kids' lives. And to open up that kind of communication and to keep it open is really, really hard. You talk about gray area. Being a parent is nothing but gray area. I mean, we all wish it was easier. We all wish that there were, you know, things that we could do that we knew would work, and things that we knew that that wouldn't work. It's an evolving, always evolving relationship. The more they're going through, the older they're getting, the more complicated it can be. But we can still have those conversations, and we can still have that openness.
Yeah. As in most fields, there are very siloed, sorry to mix metaphors, there are silos in the recovery world about like how you should handle just about everything. And so there is the group over here that says that when Nick got to the point where he was not within shouting distance of his right mind, as Stephen King likes to say in On Writing, and which is also one of my favorite recovery memoirs out there, On Writing, by Stephen King, great book. Not within shouting distance of his right mind, you should get him out of your house and cut off all contact on money unless he's willing to get sober, versus the other, some of the other conversations that are out there that I hear you be a proponent for. And I would love to hear why your thinking is different from just kick them out, make them hit rock bottom so that they'll snap to and go seek help, because things can't get any worse.
Well, bottom, I mean, it's a amazingly common question. It is really, really hard to navigate. But to me, there is a bottom line. And the bottom line comes from people I hear from all the time, parents who write me. And I said earlier that I hear from people who are telling me that their story is, our family story is similar to their story. But I also hear very often, but our story had a different ending. You know, my beautiful boy died. My lovely daughter didn't make it. And it often happens after the course of, like it did in my family, of attempts to try to help them over the course of years. And so it rehabs and therapists and all these different kinds of things. And I often hear from parents who tell me that they were told what I was told at different points, which was exactly what you're saying. You can't help them. They can only help themselves, and they will only help themselves if you allow them to hit rock bottom. So these people will tell me, did my child finally hit rock bottom? I hung up on them. I locked the door. I said, I can't help you until you get yourself sober. And then they died. Did they finally hit rock bottom? What we know from our research is that addiction isn't a choice. Nobody chooses to become addicted. Kids don't. It is a disease. It is a brain disease. And what we know when we think about illnesses is we know that we do not want them to get worse. We don't want people to hit rock bottom, especially because in this disease, rock bottom can mean death. But even short of that, it can mean all sorts of catastrophes. It can people wind up in the criminal justice system. They can have accidents that can cause permanent damage. We want to stop them and catch them as early as we can. Does that mean it's easy? No, it's so hard at that point. But I think that there is a incredibly dangerous mindset that tells us to stand back and let our kids figure this out themselves. It's too hard. It's too complicated. I feel like we have to be there for them. Within limits, we have to protect ourselves. We have to protect their siblings sometimes. Nick had little brother and sister when he was acting out, when he was on methamphetamine. It was not safe all the time around here. It was dangerous, and we had to protect our kids as best we could. But there was a time when I heard from people in this recovery world, including at Al-Anon meetings, so often that you have to say no. You can't help them. They have to hit bottom. But there was a time that I actually hung up on Nick when he called me asking for help. And I was just lucky because he called back the next day and he did go into treatment. But again, I hear over and over again from people who hang up the phone in that way, who never have another chance. And so we were just lucky, but I feel like, in the movie A Beautiful Boy, there is a moment where the dad, Steve Carell, who's playing me, which is weird, but that's he does tell the child, that he can't do anything, he can't help him anymore. And I really worry that that is sort of a dangerous lesson, a dangerous message, because I don't believe in letting people hit bottom.
There is this middle ground that somewhere there's a middle ground for everything. And as you said, everyone's different. And like, for example, my parent finally got into recovery when we just told her there would be no more access to the grandchildren. Christmas blew up because of a relapse, and we left, and it was ugly and it was horrible. And we were very honest with the kids about what had happened. And that was that person's quote bottom. And I'm not a huge fan of that either, because I was quote a very high functioning alcoholic. I had an email this morning from someone who was like, how do I convince my spouse that they need help? Because everything seems to be going great. They're still working. They're still functioning. In fact, they're functioning very, very well. So it's the gradient of what this bottom is, but in the end, what I like to talk about is getting to a place where you need help is like a 100-piece puzzle. And you hardly ever get to be that 100th piece, like hardly ever. It's so rare. But piece 100 can't fall into place if piece 27 and piece 32 and piece 41 aren't there. And for me, a lot of the prevention stuff that I talk about in the addiction inoculation are a lot of those puzzle pieces. But you have to think about the fact that every single conversation you may have may not probably won't lead to that big light bulb, amazing aha moment. But that 100th piece is out there. And so if you're consistently there, and you're there from a place of love and support, and not from a place of judgmental, you can hang up the phone two different ways. You can hang up the phone as a judgmental parent who's disapproving, or you can hang up the phone as a person who says, I'm going to be there for you no matter what, but it's really, really important to me that you start thinking about recovery. So I think treading that middle ground there's no easy answer. I keep a magic wand when I'm at home on the wall behind where I do interviews, because I'm constantly saying, I wish I had a real one of those, because it would be so much easier to give people the catch-all answer for when it's time, how to help a kid hear you. You did an interview once where someone said, and I can't remember who it was, that they couldn't be reached because at that point they believed that cocaine had answers you simply didn't have access to, as the sober person didn't have access to, and it can be very difficult to reach that person. But if you continue to come from a place of love and support, maybe some of that is leaking through and the puzzle pieces are falling into place.
Yeah.
All
And
right,
the puzzle that you're
go ahead.
describing, I was just going to say, the puzzle you're describing is exactly the way that Nick talks about his own journey. And he talks about the puzzle pieces that are those risk factors we talk about that actually made him into a person who, I mean, he had the genetic disposition because there was addiction in the family. He
That's
had
about, for the listeners, that's about 50 to 60% of your risk picture is genetics.
And he had the genetic piece for the mental illnesses as well. I mean, my family tree is rife with mental illnesses. And he had traumas when he was a kid. The divorce was one, and it was really hard for him. We did not protect him in the way that I wish we had. None of these are the idea that he tried marijuana when he was so young was another piece of this puzzle. All these pieces of the puzzle, he said, created the substance use disorder that ended up almost killing him. But it also was exactly what you're describing, a puzzle of pieces that are what finally allowed him 12 years ago to get into recovery and to stay into recovery. And those pieces were all critical. And some of it was involved with finally consulting the right specialists who diagnosed his mental illnesses, who got him on medication, who's in his therapy. 12 steps has been incredibly helpful to him. Just all of a sudden, I mean, also just maturing into a person who understands. He didn't understand when he was a kid at a certain point that he could be alive without substances. And suddenly he has found a miraculous life that revolves around people in recovery, and that revolves around a recovery community. Nick is married. He has this great life. He's an extraordinary person who just turned 41. And there was a time when I didn't think he was going to make it to 21.
Yeah. I want to talk also about the fact that to clarify just a little bit, you talked earlier about the fact that the younger a kid is when they start using, the higher their lifelong risk for substance use disorder. And the best numbers we have right now, it looks like if a kid starts using substances in like 8th grade, then their lifelong risk for developing substance use disorder and statistics are messy, but this is the best we've got, is somewhere around 47%, approaching 50%. But if they wait just 2 years until they're in 10th grade, it drops by like half. And then if they wait another 2 years until they're 18, it drops by half again, which is why constantly what I talk about is delay, 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 consistent and clear message of not necessarily no, not until it's legal, but in our house, it's no, not until your brain is done developing, because the adolescent brain, for the listeners, is not done developing until the early to mid 20s. And it's the reason that adolescent substance use is so much more dangerous in the short and long term to the brain than it is once you're past that point of your brain finally having all the connections that it needs to do all the adulting stuff. That's all frontal lobe stuff. So, okay. I wanted to talk really hard about this is the next really difficult question. So as difficult as it is for an adult to find treatment in this country, it's even more difficult for an adult to find treatment for a child. Lots of places. In fact, I worked at the last inpatient rehab for adolescents in the state of Vermont. And when they closed, that was it. There are no inpatient rehabs. And part of that is part of treatment trends and things like that. But how on earth, and you talk about this so eloquently in Beautiful Boy and in Clean, about trying to navigate the morass of, the scams and the places that are just have body brokers and all these terrible, horrible places out there. How do you begin to get through and untangle? Where on earth should I send my precious, precious child to get the help they need?
Yeah, it's a tragedy. We know what to do if a child has another illness. We go to our primary care doctor. And if there is a problem that the doctor feels requires more attention, they'll send us to a specialist, and the specialist will offer our treatment, whatever the appropriate treatment is. There is a specific course to go. There is not one when we have a child who has a substance use disorder. We don't even know where to start. I mean, people told me crazy stuff. I mean, they told me what you brought up before. You can't do anything. Leave him alone. Let him stay out on the streets. They told me to send him to a boot camp. That'll straighten him out. Tough love. All these kinds of and then they told me to send him to rehab. But I learned that rehab is just a word. There are rehabs that are good and that offer evidence-based treatments that actually have been shown to work. And then there are rehabs that just vilify the person. They're yelled at. They're punished again, as if they have some moral problem going on instead of an illness. So how do you find them? Well, you've got to rely once again on the people who know. When people are lost, I advise them to go to the American Society of Addiction Medicine or the American AAAP Psychiatry. They have directories on both of those websites where you can find somebody in your community who will be able to help direct you to places to appropriate treatment. Is a kind of therapist enough? Do they need to be in an outpatient program, or indeed do they need to be in a residential program? And if so, how do we find one? It is one of our, at a time when this crisis is killing, more than 100 people every single day in this country, the fact that the treatment system is in such disarray is a real shame. It's one of our national shames, and it really has to be fixed.
And the interesting thing about treatment for adolescents is it looks slightly different than treatment for adults. It's not the same thing. Relapse is a big part of kids. As I mentioned, kids don't have fully formed brains yet. So, relapse is sort of a bigger part of that picture. And then within the context of, you were talking about all these kids, people dying, we're in sort of a new frontier right now. I attended a conference recently where a physician said, so an addiction specialist said, what's interesting is that if you have taken party drugs, if you've used speed, you most likely have already had fentanyl in somewhere in those drugs. So, we're dealing with things like fentanyl that are so much more powerful, and it's what's fueling the overdose, or I prefer to say poisoning, because half the time people don't know that's what they're taking, is really fueling that crisis right now. So finding the right place, finding a place to take your kid is really tough. And there are even there are consultants out there that can help you find places, but the places that you mentioned are really your best first stop. And I also want to mention the other thing that podcasting has made possible are support podcasts for parents of kids who have been through this. There's like 5 of them out there. And if you just Google it, you can find them. But it's amazing how much more support there was even when you were going through this with Nick.
Yeah.
Did you go now? And I just want to really quickly, getting your kid help is really, really important, but the parents need to be thinking about themselves as well. How did you go to Al-Anon? Did you seek help yourself when Nick was trying to get well?
Well, at first, people told me to get help, to get support, whether it meant going to Al-Anon meetings or going to see a therapist or something. And I thought, I'm not the one with the problem. He's the one who's the problem. I have to figure out what to do to save him. But over time, I realized that they were right, that I needed help, our family needed help, because Nick's addiction wasn't only affecting him, it was affecting all of us. And it is crazy making, and it is exhausting. It was hard for me to take care of my other responsibilities, taking care of my other kids, working, never mind my relationship with my wife. I mean, it was really hard. People told me to go to Al-Anon meetings, and I was really disdainful of that idea. I'm not going to go into a place that I imagined was just a bunch of, whining people. I walked into a meeting finally. Things got so bad that I really was desperate. And I went into a meeting and I realized that's exactly where I needed to be, because I was in a room of people who understood what I was going through and had much more experience in many cases. And so they were able to help me and guide me. And in addition to that, I was able to be in a place where there was not the judgment, that I was able to be open about what I was experiencing, and I was able to cry for the first time, for example. I mean, I've been trying to keep it together for years. Finally, we went in to see a family therapist as well, and that was enormously helpful for me, for my wife, and also for our younger children, because the damage that addiction causes when it hits a family is it's enormous. And Daisy and Jasper, my younger kids, were terrified about what was happening to their big brother, who they worshipped, who they adored. They didn't understand it, of course. And in addition to that, they saw their parents completely preoccupied with their brother. So people told us to take them to, they didn't have meetings for kids where we were at that time, Alateen meetings or anything like that. Well, they weren't teenagers, they were younger. And we finally found a psychologist who helped us. And he taught them, it was enormously helpful. It didn't solve the problem, but the first thing he said to them was, it is really scary if you have somebody in your family who you love who is using drugs. And they hadn't heard that. They hadn't heard anybody recognize it. And it was really helpful to them. And then the next thing he said is, I want to teach you a word that you've never heard before. And the word is ambivalence. And it means that you can feel two things at once. And you can love somebody, and you can also in some ways hate them, and you can desperately want to see them at the same time. You can also be terrified of seeing them. And they went from being, really rigid and scared to opening up in a way that was really, really helpful to them. And we saw that person consistently over the course of years after that. And it was really helpful. So we need help. And a community of other people who are involved, whether if somebody goes to Al-Anon meetings and they don't respond to it, there are other groups of parent meetings, the parent support groups. Again, this idea that we're the only one who is suffering this, who is experiencing this, is just wrong. And a lot of times you don't even have to a group. You don't even have to go to an official group. You start having a conversation, you start being open, and you start hearing from other people who are also going through it. And just that connection, even with one person, can be enormously helpful.
I want to back up because there was a great question. Someone was asking about additional resources that we may not even think about. I want to mention two things. Number one, if you go to jessicalahey.com under the header videos, I did for a long time 90-second videos every single day about the addiction inoculation, and look for the one that's there about allies if you want to listen to it some other time. But there are lots of allies. Like I mentioned school counselors, I mentioned school nurses, and school counselors and school nurses are not necessarily your best choice for the crisis intervention stuff, but they do, number one, have access to referrals that you may not even know about. They often know best what's available in the community when it comes to, for example, sliding scale psychiatric help or free help or counseling that may not be on your radar screen. The screening that I was talking about that primary care physicians or pediatricians, that kind of thing, look for acronyms like SBIRT, S-B-I-R-T, which is screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment. And all that means is that your pediatrician is sort of creating a conversation with your kid over a long period of time. And what's fascinating about this is that when people who were sort of trying to get behind this screening thing actually surveyed parents and adolescents about whether or not you would even like to have your primary care physician be a possible resource around risk factors and substance use, people said yes. And adolescents were even really excited about it, even when the adolescents were told that sometimes their parents may have to be told when they've engaged in risky behaviors. So there are a lot of allies out there that you may not have thought of, and ones that may even pop up if you go and talk to that school nurse, that school counselor. And again, this does require for you to shed some of that shame and guilt so that you can have a conversation about it. It's really, really important. Is there anything I'm not thinking about there, David? Anyone else that you want to talk about?
Well, no, I mean, I think that you're right. And starting in your community is really great. And starting at the school, which is the obvious place, because in addition to the support that you can get, they also have their eyes on your children and can keep closer attention to your children. The Partnership for Drug-Free Kids, is that the name now, is also a great resource. And there's on their website, there's a lot of resources. And in addition, they have helplines.
Yeah, SAMHSA has a helpline. Start Googling helplines. Someone in the chat has asked us to talk about marijuana, weed. In fact, this came up yesterday. I'm here on a speaking trip talking to high school principals, and I'm supposed to be talking about my first book, and yet what everyone wanted to talk to me about was weed and vaping. Let's talk a little bit about it. There is a resource that I love to direct people to if they want like well, first of all, your book High is a fantastic sort of starting place, especially if you want to help adolescents understand a little bit more about marijuana. There's a fantastic episode of the Huberman Lab podcast that's just about cannabis, weed, marijuana, and the brain and body. It's a really good starting place for that information. But I think the conversation about marijuana is really fraught right now because of legalization, because of the fact that it's seen as no big deal. It's a plant, who cares, you know? Can you sort of frame some of the conversations around, let's say you found out Nick was smoking weed at 11, how do you get past that? Well, it's no big deal, everybody does it. It's just a part of experimentation kind of thing.
Yeah. And like you said, the idea that the fact that marijuana is not any longer illegal in many places is really confusing to kids, because the assumption there is, okay, we know it's safe, it's fine. But we also know that alcohol is legal and cigarettes are legal, and we know that we also don't want our children using them. And the problem with marijuana in particular is that there are many, many, many fallacies. People just don't understand that there is hard evidence that shows people, if you talk to kids, a lot of times they'll say, well, you can't get addicted to marijuana. It's not true.
Not true.
You can get addicted to marijuana, and I've been at programs, I've visited programs which are just for adolescent kids who are addicted to marijuana, and they wouldn't be in a program if their life had not spiraled downward because of their marijuana use, and they can't stop. They can't stop on their own. You talked about the evolving adolescent brain that continues to change until mid-20s, whatever it is. Marijuana has been shown to have an impact on that evolving brain, and of course, it makes sense. If your child is smoking marijuana all the time, it's going to have an impact, and it does. So our children have to learn. The old messages, don't do drugs because they're bad for you, and just say no. We know that those very simplistic messages don't work. But also, kids aren't stupid, and if we can go to them with the facts and educate them. And show how the research, like you mentioned, that Huberman report thing is a great example of somebody who talks about this and the science of this. Kids need to know that marijuana is not harmless. The question of legalization is a whole other question about whether people should be criminalized for what ultimately is a health problem.
Right.
But marijuana is it has a huge impact on people's lives. It is a predictor of using other drugs. It is also a predictor of it exacerbates other mental health problems. Partly it masks them, and second of all, marijuana makes, for example, depression worse. People may get some relief in the short term for anxiety or depression, but ultimately it makes those things worse. So our jobs is to educate in a way that is based, again, on the real facts, on science, not just trying to scare our kids.
And for me, the other big hurdle then, okay, I know if I can get the facts, even if I say those facts to kids, it has a big effect on the brain. What I have found in talking to kids is the more specific and the more relevant I can make it to them. So let's say, for example, we have a kid who wants to study, they want to go to college and they want to study X. If you mention to them that one of the biggest impacts we see on marijuana use in adolescence is a shrinking of the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is the center of memory consolidation. It's the part of the brain we really, really need in order to process information for memory consolidation. And it's why that whole, the joke about people who smoke weed not being able to remember anything, their short-term memory just going kablooey. And there's very real reasons for that. The things that we're constantly trying to get kids to be able to do, like keep track of their stuff, all of that adulting stuff, that's all prefrontal cortex and frontal lobe stuff, the part of the brain that doesn't connect until the very end of adolescence. if your kids are like, I don't know why I can't remember my backpack and my homework and all that stuff, what they should also know is that chronic use of marijuana, also we've seen thinning in the prefrontal cortex and the frontal lobe. And that's not good either. The very things you need to do in order to be able to go out in the world and take over the world and make the world a better place and stake your claim on the world is to be able to do some of that adulting, and weed messes with your frontal lobe as well. So the more you know about your kid, the more you know about their goals, wishes, priorities, all that sort of stuff, the more you have levers. The more, whether it's, you're not going to be able to play on the soccer team next semester if you're caught with weed, or, if you want, if we're seeing these grades in decline, do you think that could have anything to do with a reduction in your short-term memory because of the weed? All of these conversations, as I said, the more relevant you can make them to the kid, like they tend to only care if it really messes with them. It has to be real to them. So anyway, that's one way that you can make those conversations work. There's a question: what reasonable recommendations do you have to beat the nature of teen curiosity and risky behavior, even when you're a caregiver focused on building protective factors? Do you want to take a quick shot at that one with the protection stuff, or do you want to?
Well, I think that part of it is that, we have to acknowledge what kids are, and that their curiosity is natural, that the idea that kids want to experience the extremes of emotion is natural. So the more we can help them find other ways to explore those things, the healthier it is. And that's to help get them involved in various kinds of things, help your child figure out what their passions are and how to pursue them. And
the adolescent brain is wired for novelty. And if we can find healthy ways to channel that and to get them trying new things and getting those neurotransmitters, going in the brain where they're like getting that little rush of, learning something new, that can be a great way to sort of channel that need for risk and novelty.
That's right.
Yeah. I always say the more you understand about the adolescent brain, the less frustrating they are, the easier it is to parent them. Whether you're reading Dan Siegel, whether you're reading Frances Jensen, at jessicalahey.com, under speaking on the menu, there's a big button that says download speaking bibliography, and all of those books are there. But Dan Siegel's book on the adolescent brain and Frances Jensen's book on the adolescent brain, all wonderful, wonderful resources for understanding just why this period of development is so important and so delicate, tenuous, and why we need to protect their brains.
It is possible. People don't believe that it is possible to have a child open to you about whatever it is they're experiencing, even if they have experimented in their thinking, experimented with marijuana. If you have an open relationship with your child, and if they know that they're allowed to have that conversation, kids will be open. Not always, and not the first conversation. It's not going to happen in that way. But a lot of times the conversation can focus on their peer groups. Do you know people who are doing this? Are you worried about anybody? What's going, and understanding this connection. I always cite this survey that was done across the country where they tried to figure out what kids were caused them to use drugs, and parents always assumed that the answer is their friends, peer pressure. But there was a survey done that showed that kids said, there were 7,000 kids that were interviewed, and they said that the reason they use drugs, or the reason they imagined their friends would use drugs, was because, number one, of stress. So there's a lot of conversations that we can have to help our kids pay attention to the stresses that they're under, communicate the stresses they're under, help them get help if they need help, help them if they're struggling academically, to get them some help that is not, again, not judgmental. And that to open up a line of communication. When that line of communication is open, that's always the first step in being able to solve whatever problems come up, whatever it is.
I always like to have that moment where I remind myself that what is more important in this conversation is continuing communication with my kid, not my being right, not my letting them know that I disapprove, but continuing communication with my kid. It's really important. We're running out of time, and I want to make sure someone asked really specifically about genetics, to add the basically, where are you looking, how far afield do you need to consider, all that sort of stuff. Generally speaking, we're concerned with first and second degree relatives. However, when we talk about genetic risk, there's also this fun little thing called epigenetics, which has to do with sort of the way, you know, stress and trauma actually impact your genes. But really, if you're looking at your family and you look at first and second degree relatives, you're pretty safe sort of knowing that that's part of your genetic risk picture. And rather than freaking out about it, rather than getting all guilty and horrified by it, start thinking about, number one, how on earth can we break the cycle with this next generation? And that's through really effective prevention. And we know prevention works. And number two, by understanding that genetic, it's not necessarily destiny, it's part of their genetic makeup, but that needs to be part of the conversation, because when a kid understands that they're at higher risk for substance use disorder, that can be just one of those things that make them go, maybe not. And every little bit helps.
That's exactly right. One of the things that Nick said was that when he started to use drugs, and he was with other people, other kids who were using drugs, he recognized that he was reacting differently to, he responded differently. He wanted more very quickly, and he didn't just want more of the same drug, he wanted harder drugs because of the relief that they provided for his anxiety, for his depression, whatever it was. He didn't, again, know why, but he did know that. And so if he had known that he did have addiction in his family, an alcoholic grandfather, you know, other addiction, then maybe he would have paid attention to the fact that he was experiencing drug use differently. And maybe that could have led to a conversation way, way, way earlier about the fact that he was trying these drugs and why.
We actually have this conversation a lot in our house, since my kids are at higher risk for various reasons. I also have a queer kid, and that puts her at higher risk. And, you know, all these things, we talk about all this stuff. And so one of the conversations we have a lot in our house is, what's the difference between like people who can have a drink and walk away from it versus me? And there's a great quote from Stephen King's On Writing, where a friend of his was asked by his physician, how much do you drink? And the guy said, well, all of it, because that's how sort of our brains work. And I want to use this one, like 30 seconds, just to say that this is a really good way to talk about the fact that the reason that I like to talk a lot about the myth of sipping at home, and that being a way to help kids, like maybe they won't freak out later about alcohol, maybe it'll help them learn to moderate. They want to be like those European families that can have a little wine and not go overboard. I have a couple of things I want to point out. The European Union has the highest drinking rates in the world, depending on the country, but they have the highest rates of disease attributable to alcohol and of deaths attributable to alcohol. So holding the European Union up as the end all be all for moderation, probably not a great idea. And also, as we mentioned before, the younger a kid is when they have their first use, the higher their lifelong risk of developing substance use disorder. And finally, we know that parents that have a consistent and clear message of no, not until your brain is done developing, have kids with much lower levels of substance use disorder over their lifetime. And finally, if you're my parent, teaching me about moderation is never going to work, because I can't learn moderation. So it's, you know, you're trying to put insurance on something that you can't really put insurance on. So I'd love to bust that European moderation myth. I would also love to bust the myth of they're going to do it anyway, I might as well let them do it in the basement and I'll take everyone's keys. Not only are you increasing your child's risk for substance use disorder when you allow your kid to drink in your home, you're also by proxy raising their peers' risk of substance use, because if you're including them in those things, and peers also, peer cohort is a big part of risk factor. So the two big examples I have of when parents let their kids drink at home, we need to blow those up, because both of them increase risk for substance use.
Excellent suggestion and excellent thoughts. I have a quick question. Recently, we hosted a Glenbard grad, Dr. Tim Fong, who's an addiction psychiatrist. He talked about the normal risk behavior that a student will as part of adolescence. And that he made mention of the fact that, but it wasn't easy back then when he was a teenager. But now, with that easy access, how much more challenging for parents and students? Do you want to comment about that?
Well, it is incredibly challenging. I mean, as hard as it was, for when I was young, it's not the accessibility, the prevalence of drugs is not there. Also, there were not the kinds of stresses in our lives, and so I think he's absolutely right, and it goes back to therefore what do we do about it? A lot of it is about education. The other one is about recognizing the early signs of problems. And the other one is about the conversations that we have, the openness we have with our children, and getting help as soon as we recognize that there might be a problem.
Well, so many important points. Mila, did you have a quick question before we say goodbye?
I just have one quick one from a prevention standpoint. At what age would you start to have conversations, and where would you start? Because I think this is so much, and it's all, you've given some really specific examples, but we've done education from the health department on tobacco for a lot of years, and so we're looking now with some of these other issues. Where do you start, and how do you do that?
Pre-K and kindergarten is when substance use prevention starts. The best, most effective substance use prevention programs that we know of, as looked up, for example, through blueprints at University of Colorado Boulder, it doesn't start with a discussion about crystal methamphetamine. It starts with a discussion about why we don't swallow the toothpaste, what's topical and what goes inside the body, why there's a label on prescription pills that has a very specific name on it. Sweetie, I know you're learning your letters at school. Can you find the letters of mommy's name on this prescription bottle? Why do you think my name is on the prescription bottle? Like, if you had what I have, can you take my medicine? Of course not. You never take a medicine that is a prescription medicine that is not prescribed for you. And then as kids get older and they learn, they either see things in their environment, or they're running up against things, or you see things on television, those conversations can happen developmentally. But pre-K and kindergarten, pre-K.
I love that, especially with the gummy medicine and now the gummy THC products, and that sounds great.
I actually got an email from a woman just recently whose 6-year-old took all of the gummies that were left in her husband's car after a camping trip. He was violently ill. And she's like, I never thought I would have to deal with this question of how to talk to my 6-year-old about these hallucinations and all the stuff that happened to him, because we were dumb enough to leave, weed out where he could find it.
David Sheff, you were great at the previous in-person events, and you're just as wonderful and compassionate, so much wisdom. And Jessica, you are the perfect person to talk with David about these critically important issues for our children. I'm so grateful. And everyone who's listening, so many of us that are here, make a phone call, let someone know they need to come back at 7 p.m. tonight, where we'll have this conversation once again. Thank you, David. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Mila. Thank you, everyone who's listening in. This is where we go hug the kids. So let's go hug the kids.
Thank you, Gilda.
Ready.